The Imperial Salvage Commission had rejected the boy's application 14 times before Veth Orassil ever saw a single drawing. Orassil learned this fact from the dockmaster's ledger on the morning he arrived at berth 41 to complete his annual audit of the Keleth orbital yards. The dockmaster, a heavy-set Thari man named Reuven Solt, handed him the ledger with the resigned expression of someone presenting evidence of a recurring problem that nobody had yet solved. "The human apprentice," Solt said. "Kael Maren, 17 years old. He's applied for a salvage modification permit every 3 weeks for the past 14 months. Orassil looked at the ledger. 14 rejections in 14 months, each stamped in red by a different committee member, each citing a slightly different version of the same concern. Undersized applicant, insufficient formal credentials, proposed modification exceeds standard apprentice scope, proposal lacks supporting engineering documentation from a certified professional." "And the modification itself?" Orassil asked. Solt hesitated. "That's the thing, Commissioner. He's been building it anyway." Berth 41 was the deep end of the Keleth yards, the graveyard section, where decommissioned hulls went to be stripped down to components and the components resold, and where the salvage apprentices were assigned the work nobody else wanted. Orassil had been a salvage commissioner for 19 years and had walked through dozens of yards like this. The smell of coolant fluid and cut metal, the low groan of magnetic cranes overhead, the stutter of welding arcs in the deeper bays. He found Kael Maren on the lower level of Bay 12, which was the farthest bay from the main inspection office and therefore, Orassil noted, the one where an apprentice could work undisturbed for the longest stretch. The boy had his back to the access ladder, crouched over a workbench covered in components that did not belong to any current salvage assignment. A portable light rig hung from a ceiling hook above him, casting everything in sharp, useful white. His hands were moving over a circuit board with the automatic precision of someone who had done this operation so many times that his hands knew it better than his eyes did. The thing on the workbench was not small. It occupied most of the bench and extended onto a floor cradle beside it, a propulsion assembly, Orassil could see, pulled from at least 3 different decommissioned hulls and integrated with a degree of care that made him stop walking before he had fully decided to stop. The components were old. The welds were not. They were clean and tight and done in a sequence that suggested the person doing them understood load distribution across mismatched materials, which was not, by any definition, apprentice-level work. Orassil said nothing. He watched. Kael reached for a calibration tool without looking up, found it where he'd left it, and made an adjustment on the left side coupling that was so small Orassil wouldn't have known to look for it if he hadn't spent 2 decades auditing propulsion systems. The boy set the tool down. He picked up a handwritten diagram from the corner of the bench, a paper diagram, pencil, the kind nobody used anymore, and held it at arm's length beside the assembly, moving his gaze back and forth between the drawing and the part. He was checking his own work against a design he had drawn himself. "Apprentice Maren," Orassil said. The boy spun around. He was lean and dark-haired and had the particular quality of attention of someone who has learned to operate without oversight and is now rapidly reassessing whether that independence is about to become a liability. He was also, Orassil noted, not particularly frightened. Startled, yes. Frightened, no. "Commissioner Orassil," Kael said. He recognized the formal audit sash, which most apprentices could identify and most immediately found discomfiting. "I can explain." "Please do," Orassil said. The explanation took 11 minutes, which was longer than most commission interviews Orassil had conducted in Bay 12, and it was more organized than he expected. Kael had started with a broken tertiary thruster pulled from a Class 4 salvage hull 2 years ago, his first month as an apprentice, before he had any formal training beyond what the dockmaster's manual covered. The thruster had a damaged ignition manifold, and the repair parts for that model had been out of production for 30 years. Standard protocol said, strip it for components, catalog what's usable, move on. Kael had not moved on. He had spent 3 weeks in his bunk after shift reading every scrap of documentation he could find on Class 4 ignition systems. He had pulled compatible parts from 7 different decommissioned models. He had rebuilt the manifold from components that were not originally designed to work together, which required understanding not just what each piece did individually, but what happened at the interface between them, which was, Orassil knew, the part of propulsion engineering that took most licensed engineers 5 years of structured training to grasp. The manifold had worked. That was the beginning. Over the next 14 months, Kael had expanded outward from the manifold, adding a secondary coupling from a light courier hull, rerouting the fuel feed through a modified compression chamber from a bulk freighter, fabricating a thrust vectoring bracket by hand because the original design he wanted didn't exist in any current catalog, and he had needed to invent it. The bracket, Orassil said, interrupting for the first time. He crossed to the workbench and examined it without touching. The bracket was stamped from a salvaged hull plate and machined down. He could see the cut marks, to tolerances that would have required a precision lathe, of which Bay 12 had exactly one, which was listed in the facility log as used exclusively for cataloging work. When did you use the lathe? Orassil asked. Third shift, Kael said, after the day crew leaves. How long have you been doing third shift? The boy was quiet for a moment. 14 months, he said. Orassil looked at the assembly. 14 months of third shifts, after a full day of assigned salvage work, in the farthest bay from the main office, building something that the commission had refused to certify 14 times without ever being shown what it could actually do. He looked at Kael. Show me the application documents, he said. Kael had them in a folder on the shelf above the bench, a paper folder, same as the diagram, which told Orassil something about how the boy had been trained and something about how he thought about records. The applications were thorough. Each one included a materials list, a component provenance chart, a hand-drawn technical diagram, and a brief paragraph explaining the modification's intended function. The committee stamps were all on the front page of each application. Most of the committee reviewers had not turned past the first page. Orassil paged through them slowly. He was aware, as he read, of the quality of these documents. They were not the work of someone who had formal training in technical writing or engineering notation. The notation system Kael used was partially invented, readable, internally consistent, but different from the commission's standard format in ways that would immediately mark it as amateur to anyone who didn't look past the surface. He had no professional endorsements. No certified engineer had co-signed. His workshop address was Bay 12, sub-level, which was not a listed fabrication facility. Every box the commission required ticked, and the commission had been reading the boxes rather than the content inside them. What's the intended function? Orassil asked, though he had already read the paragraph. Atmospheric entry assist for small salvage vessels, Kael said. He said it without the defensive edge Orassil might have expected, not with the certainty of someone who had been told they were right, but with the flat, careful precision of someone who had verified it themselves and no longer needed external confirmation. Most of the decommissioned hulls in this yard can't enter planetary atmospheres anymore. Their entry systems are degraded or stripped. This assembly would let a small salvage team take a stripped hull down to a low-orbit recovery site without a dedicated tug. It would cut recovery costs by roughly 40% on Class 4 through Class 6 hulls. Orassil set the folder down. You've run the cost projections. On the shelf, Kael said, second folder. There was a second folder. The cost projections were in it. They were correct. Orassil was a salvage commissioner, which meant his days were organized around the gap between what things were worth and what people assumed they were worth. He had spent 19 years finding value in decommissioned systems that facilities had already written off. He was, within his professional category, considered one of the better ones at this, at seeing the functional object inside the listed as scrap hull, at reading past the depreciation figure to what the underlying engineering was actually capable of. He had not, until this moment, applied that same discipline to a 17-year-old apprentice in a sub-level bay. The realization arrived without drama. He simply stood there with the cost projection in his hand and noticed, in the specific, technical way he noticed things, that the gap between what this boy had built and what the commission had assumed he was capable of was the same kind of gap he corrected in salvage assessments every week. He had been auditing decommissioned equipment for 19 years. He had never thought to audit a person the same way. The committee cited insufficient engineering documentation, Orassil said. Yes, Kael said. There was no bitterness in it. There was something else, a kind of endurance that had been in place long enough that it no longer felt like effort. They meant they needed a licensed engineer's countersignature. I know. I wrote to 3 licensed engineers asking if they'd review my documents. 2 didn't respond. 1 responded and said the modification was too unconventional for him to endorse without a full professional assessment, which would cost more than my year's wage. Orassil set the cost projection back in the folder. He crossed to the assembly and looked at it for a long moment, not the way an auditor looks at something, assessing and cataloging, but the way a person looks at something that has turned out to be exactly what it claimed to be. Does it work? He asked. Kael said, I'd like to show you. There was a stripped Class 4 hull in Bay 12's upper dock, a courier freighter, decommissioned 4 years ago, listed in the asset register as entry system deficient and therefore ground tethered. Kael had filed paperwork 8 months ago requesting permission to use it for a test run. The request was still pending in the commission's processing queue. In the absence of approval, he had simply kept preparing. He had mounted the assembly to the freighter's secondary drive housing over the previous 6 weeks. He had run his diagnostic checks 17 times. He had filed 3 test flight notification forms, none of which had been processed. Orassil looked at the paperwork, then he looked at the assembly, then he looked at the boy. Under my authority as a sitting commissioner, he said, I'm approving a supervised test run. Get your safety harness. What followed was 22 minutes. The Class 4 hull lifted from the dock on its main drives first, sluggishly, the way a vessel with degraded systems always lifted, with reluctance, as if the machinery was surprised to be asked again after so long. Then Kael engaged the assembly, and the reluctance ended. The entry assist system brought the hull to test altitude in a clean arc, with a stability that told anyone who had logged hours on degraded hulls what kind of engineering was behind it. Orassil watched from the dock observation point and said nothing, because there was nothing technical left to say. The instrument panel at the observation point showed thrust distribution, fuel efficiency, entry angle correction, all of it performing inside the parameters Kael had projected in his second folder, on his own figures, without anyone else's verification. The hull landed. Kael came down the access ramp with his helmet under his arm and oil on his left sleeve, and he walked to where Orassil was standing and waited. He did not perform confidence. He just waited, the way someone waits who has done the work and does not need the outcome to tell him whether the work was good. You built that in 3 years, Orassil said. 14 months for the assembly, 2 years of parts sourcing before that. Orassil was quiet for a moment. He thought about the 14 rejections in the ledger. He thought about the folder of applications that 14 different committee members had stamped without reading past the first page. He thought about third shifts for 14 months, penciled diagrams on salvaged paper, a lathe used after hours in the farthest bay from the main office. I'm filing a formal assessment, he said. Today, it will supersede the previous rejections and authorize your modification for commission-approved use in Class 4 through Class 6 recovery operations. He paused. I'm also filing a second form, a certification review, not an apprentice level. Kael looked at him. You're going to tell me I need a licensed engineer's endorsement, the boy said. I'm going to tell you that I hold certification authority within this commission, Orassil said, and that I have just supervised a successful operational test of a propulsion modification that performs within documented parameters. My endorsement counts. He held the boy's gaze. I'm recommending you for junior engineering certification, not because I think it will be easy to get approved. Because it will be harder than it should be, and you will do it anyway. And I would rather the commission have your name in the right category of the register before someone else's yard finds you first. Kael was quiet for a moment. He had the particular stillness of someone receiving something they had stopped expecting. Thank you, he said. Orassil looked back at the hull sitting on the dock. A ship that had been written off as too degraded to fly, restored to function by an apprentice working alone in the dark for a year and a half, without permission, without endorsement, without anything but the certainty that the thing he was building would work if he built it right. Don't thank me, Orassil said. I'm an auditor. I found something that was being misclassified. He picked up his ledger. That's what I'm paid for. He walked back to the inspection office to file the forms, and behind him the dock was quiet, and the Class 4 hull sat there at its berth with its entry assist system dark and cooling, worth considerably more than anyone in this yard had been willing to write down.